So yeah, starting off with why this paper. So basically the last 2 years have been an intensive learning experience for us as GADN, kind of trying to figure out what our role in global feminist movements should be, and if such global feminist movements can even exist given the power imbalances. And when I talk about these power contexts, I mainly mean the toxic interaction of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism that obviously also deeply shape the embedded inequalities within the international development sector. And so changing these power structures cannot happen simply by claiming to be, for example, more Southern-led, which I think is something that we've all been hearing come up a little bit more, also as part of the decolonization discussion. And so we do share the concern that Northern organizations actually risk perpetuating these power imbalances and being part of the problem, rather than challenging this context. And so we do see that there is a duty for us as Northern-based organizations to reflect on our roles and then challenge ourselves to change accordingly. And so with this paper, we basically wanted to further our own understanding on these issues, but also spark debate with others. So we're really grateful that you're all here today to do that with us. Next slide, please. So in terms of approach, we did a literature review, and the paper is also based on the rich conversations with other feminists that we've been party to over the past decade. And in addition to that, we also conducted interviews with feminist advocates from around the world. And as we said, 2 of them are here today as well to speak a little bit and share their reflection. And these interviews have also done a peer review of the draft, so we're really thankful for that. So as I said, it's a discussion paper, which means that we did not intend to reach any definitive conclusions, any answers, any one-size-fits-all solutions. You're not going to find that in the paper, but instead really wanted to encourage this critical reflection and also underline the need to then take subsequent action accordingly. Because sometimes we might have this tendency of doing all this critical reflection, but then stopping there, but that won't actually lead to anything. So we do need to make sure that we change accordingly. And that was also a point that was frequently made to us throughout this process by our interviews. And yeah, so by sharing our reflections and some of these critical questions in the paper, we are inviting others, such as yourselves, to consider some of these questions as well. Next slide. Thank you. So when we started developing the process, obviously we thought about global north, global south, do these analytical frameworks work in this context, and kind of found that it is rather inadequate to describe the current realities in the sector, given, for example, INGOs that are decentralizing, but also more diverse base of staff in organizations that come with their own individual and more complex positionalities that then further kind of muddy the water between what is global north, what is global south. So instead, what we've kind of come up with in the paper is what we term global north power and privilege. And what we mean with that is basically the benefit that individuals and organizations derive from their affiliation with the global north, wherever they're geographically located. And so these individuals and organizations, such as ourselves, have to acknowledge the ways in which we benefit from this global north power and privilege. Whew, I need some. No, I'm talking very fast with you, I'm sorry. So yeah, as GADN, we obviously recognize that we have this positionality, we are an organization that benefits from global north power and privilege. And so in producing the paper and collating others' views, we also recognize that inevitably we are contributing our own biases and opinions. And now you've heard from me enough for now. I'll hand over to Jess, who will talk you through the roles that we've identified.
The next slide. So what we tried to do was to look at what roles Northern organisations are playing at the moment and what roles could they play. And what we first described was the role that most organisations aim or purport to play currently, which could be seen as a distributive one, where we're acting as intermediaries in transferring funds or other resources and opening access to decision makers. But what we reflected on was how many questions this raises in terms of how we're perpetuating colonial relationships in doing that. How much money have we siphoned off in indirect costs with grants that could have gone directly to the global south? Essentially, all the funds that we raise could be going to the global south. So are we spending these wisely enough? How often have we constrained Southern advocates, inviting them to speak about case studies rather than recognising their strategic expertise, or telling them what to say so that they fit UK agendas and back up our advocacy messages rather than giving them the space to say what they want to say? How many times have we extracted information without citation or included our partners in consultation processes and neither listened to them nor paid for their time? and many negative images have further victimized those in the global south in the name of our communications work. And actually, are we really best placed to do the things that need doing to meet our aims? Or could they be done better by those in the global south? And one of the people that we talked to, Sachini Pereira from Research, reflected the views of a number of people when she suggested that particularly INGOs should be thinking about sunsetting, about gradually transferring roles, resources and power to organisations in the global south. But I think what's challenging, particularly for those of us who are white, who are British and who've worked in the sector for a long time, is does that mean we should shut up shop altogether? And I know that it's something that a lot of us personally have considered, but the answer we got was a pretty resounding no. I'll do the next slide. That what we heard really loudly and clearly from the people we were talking to is that those of us who benefit from global North power and privilege have a clear responsibility and in fact even duty to act and to atone. Our role then becomes one of challenger, holding our governments to account for past harm and present damage. Our legitimacy and motivation come from recognition of that responsibility as the electorate for what our governments are doing and have done in our name, and not because of our relationship with southern partners. Our government acts in our name with our taxes, and it's our responsibility to do something about it.
As we kind of alluded to at the beginning of the paper, we also identified some practical changes that we need to make no matter if we take some redistributive role or challenger role. And so I want to discuss some of these today. So the first one is kind of under the heading of from self-reflection to change. So as I said before, honest self-reflection on our self-interest is very critical, but that has to lead to actual change and not seeing ourselves as the neighbor of the world, where critical self-examination is the goal in itself. Next slide, please. Which is around kind of the challenges of being Southern-led. So what we've heard from our interviews was that there is actually not really a consensus if being Southern-led is the way to go, or if there should in fact be a more equal and collaborative effort in this. But I would say no matter, or we identified in the paper that no matter where on the scale of how Southern-led are we fall, you definitely should, or we definitely should include transforming power and transferring resources and being Southern-led and not just claiming to do so. Another important thing that was pointed out to us is to be careful not to burden those in the global south with our desire to be led by them, and also mindful of the extractive nature of consultation as it is taking place at the moment. So we should develop genuine consultation that is also acted on, no matter how disruptive it might be to our prior assumptions or also to our organizational boundaries. And then that consultation has to be remunerated and recognized and respected as Southern actors are putting their time and expertise into these consultations. Further, we were told that we shouldn't treat the global south as monolithic. There are clear differences between the regions and also between single countries, so there are more differentiated approaches in our work needed. And with that, we should also be more intentional and transparent about who we work with and who these organizations or actors in turn represent. Sorry? They can't hear me. Sorry, people on Zoom. Sorry, I hope you can hear me better now. So next slide, please. Which is around moving away from growth imperatives and donor-led reporting, rather focusing on long-term commitment to transformative change, because what good does it do if we tick the box of our deliverable but not actually achieve transformative change? Then it was also suggested to us to be more radical in our demands, because what we've heard is that often us as Northern actors tend to kind of tone down the demands, make them less radical, so they're more appealing to our decision makers. But that's something that we actually shouldn't be doing. We should adopt these more radical demands, and with that also be prepared to potentially lose access to our decision makers if that's necessary. Next slide, please. The last one is around challenging the division of labor in global work, where often the global North is tasked to do this global work and produce the analysis, while the Southern actors, as Jess said, are then kind of brought in to bring the case studies and the stories and provide these illustrative examples. When in reality, obviously, Southern actors are perfectly capable of bringing in the theoretical analysis. They have the advocacy experience and the expertise, and also the ability to strategize. So we need to question this division of labor.
Another point around this was to obviously acknowledge contributions and expertise in all its forms, with remuneration as well as giving the credit. Then we also talk about the importance of translation in the paper, and that can go beyond translating our own work, again, thinking that we're the navel of the world, producing the publications that are worth reading, but maybe also thinking about what other publications that aren't available in English could be translated into English by us, and that would be a more useful contribution so that we can then learn from that. And then one last point that I'd like to end with is to always, always, always speak up and call out racism and neo-colonial practices wherever and whenever they happen without being asked, especially for those of us that are racialized as white. And over to Jess. Do you also want to hold this? Okay.
I can't hold the mic and put my glasses on. I can't multitask. Can we get the... Okay, so in doing this paper, obviously, we felt it was really important for us not only to reflect on what the paper meant for us, but also to be very public about that and to share it. We've really just touched the surface with what we said today. It just raised so many issues for us and so useful. The first thing was that we're actually at the moment doing our next 3-year strategy. And this has really helped us. And I think particularly the thing that's really helped us on is separating out these two roles and making sure that we're doing enough of the challenger role, challenging the UK government to atone for past and present harm. And it's given us, I think, more confidence, if you like, to do that role, because there's been an extent to which the word Southern-led, I think, sometimes has stopped those of us in the North from recognising our own responsibility. And we've got a bit confused and mixed up about what Southern-led actually means. And it's starting to help us untangle that. The second one, and a lot of these will come up again, but this thing about using income wisely, I think really resonated for us as well, of making sure that we don't follow the growth imperative, that we only take what we need and we use that wisely, that every trip we take, we think, do we have to make that trip? Just because it's project money and that it's in the bag doesn't mean that we shouldn't spend it wisely. Another one that we came up with was more profound consultation processes. And in this paper, it was a small effort, a small contribution, but we consulted everybody twice, once at the start of paper and once at the end. And that made a really big difference, I think, to the wealth of information that we got. And we deliberately invited people to challenge us, and some of them certainly did. The other thing was to broaden out who we work with. And we are certainly guilty of working with a small number of people that we know really well who basically speak English. Despite the fact Yamina speaks, I think, every language that there is. And this translation point that Yamina mentioned, it's a really small point, but to me it really resonated. Why do we think we're doing the world a favour by translating all our work into other languages rather than reading other people's work that was written in other languages? It's such a small point, but to me it kind of summed up the whole process for me, the arrogance of thinking that language is about translating our work rather than reading the work of others. There's some things that we're going to continue to do. We'd already decided not to sub-grant. A lot of our work is around publicising the policy work of Southern advocates, and this thing around changing the global division of labour, which was another thing that kind of really struck me in the paper, and also the work on anti-racism, on stepping up and calling out. And I think overall, knowing as Northern-based organisations and actors, when do you step forward and when do you step back? And for me, that was sort of quite a good framing. The final thing for me was just to say that this paper came out of a project which I'm actually really proud of, not because we met our deliverables, because we didn't, but because we changed. We totally 180-degree changed what we were going to do with the project, partly because we had good funders. But to me, that's quite special in a way, and I'm quite proud of that. And I think we should be more proud of learning and listening and changing and saying, actually, we got it wrong to begin with, and we listened to these other people and we've changed. And that, again, was a sort of trigger point for me in the paper. We really hope that there's lots of kind of trigger points for all of you as well. We're going to let people do questions in a sec, because what I'm going to do now is introduce our two speakers, if that's okay, and then we're going to bring them in, and then a chance for all of you to ask questions, if that's okay. So we got. Can we make it so that we can get Dinah and Priyanthi bigger? So our two speakers were both people who contributed to the paper, both at interview stage and at peer review. Dinah Musindarwezo is an African feminist based in Nairobi and currently works as Director of Policy and Communications at Womankind Worldwide. Before joining, she was Executive Director of FemNet, which is a Pan-African feminist network of women's rights organisations and individuals in Africa. And for over 15 years, Dinah has dedicated her time to work towards achieving gender equality and women's and girls' rights through working with national, regional, and international NGOs and movements. And then our other speaker, Priyanthi Fernando, is a Sri Lankan feminist and Executive Director of International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, or IRO-AP. She looks back on a long history of working in development and more recently in human rights from a Global South perspective. Experiences of working in these spaces and with Global North-based organisations in different roles have formed her current thinking. We've quoted both of them liberally in the paper, but it's really nice to have you both here now. And I know time zones are such that now's not a brilliant time for you, so extra thank you both for being here. I'm going to pass over to Yamina.
Thanks, Jess. I hope you can hear us on Zoom. Thank you both for being here. So yeah, we basically want to ask you a couple of questions so that you can also share your reflections from the paper. I'd start the first question with you, Priyanthi. It's kind of odd to know where to look because there's an audience here. There's a camera there. I see you over here. Maybe let me sit here. There we go. So in the paper, we identified two potential roles, as we discussed, one challenging our governments and then two redistributing resources back to the Global South. In your view, would you say this is a useful distinction? And if so, what are some of the strengths and the weaknesses of both of these roles? And if you think, actually, no, these are not useful roles that you identified, then what other potential roles do you see for Northern organizations? Dinah, if I can pass over to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Yamina. Okay, so first of all, I want to acknowledge all the feminists that I have worked with, advocates from this part of the world in Africa, but also globally, that have informed my thinking and analysis, whose knowledge and wisdom, if I had not drawn on them, I wouldn't have been able to be speaking here, and I wouldn't have been able to contribute analysis to the paper that we are discussing today. So to answer your question, yes, I do agree that those are two critical roles. If I would start with the one in terms of the role of Northern organization in carrying out advocacy and holding their own governments accountable, I think that's really critical because as advocates, oftentimes in the global north, are also citizens of the northern countries. They pay taxes and they vote their leaders who are the decision makers. And I think only that positionality gives them the right to hold their leaders accountable to social justice. But also with regard to holding northern governments accountable, and the role of the northern NGOs or organizations is also ensuring that we are holding governments accountable on board, that we are being bold and we are being courageous, that we are able to advocate for issues that are going to change the status quo, that we are talking about issues that are going to challenge the global inequalities that do exist and continue to exist in favor of the northern countries against southern government, but of course also the people that are in these countries. And so I call colleagues in fellow northern organizations such as mine to not shy away from challenging the narrative and really holding governments on issues that are more systematic in nature, that are more structured in nature, that can actually bring about transformation. So issues around least financial flows, issues around tax justice, issues around climate justice, issues around COVID-19 vaccination equity. Those are some of the issues that are extremely, pertinent. Issues around, debt crisis that has been raising, especially because of COVID-19 crisis, are some of the issues that I think that we need to be speaking about. And if I'm quite honest, oftentimes when I'm in the spaces with colleagues in the Global North, now that I work in the Global Northern organization, these issues don't come out easily, and oftentimes those are not the issues that we focus on and really call our governments to be accountable on those issues. And yet we know that's where change is going to happen once we address those issues. And the second one, in terms of resourcing, so yeah, I do believe that Northern organizations do raise money from their public. Womankind Worldwide draws a big percentage of our money comes from individual giving, for example. And those resources, we are able to use those resources, of course, for our own operations, but also to fund partners in the Global South in a flexible manner. So those resources, if they are going to be redistributed to partners in the Global South in a way that is really useful and is funding the vision of those organizations, as opposed to projects and ideas that are preconceived by Northern organization, then I think that's a useful role. But I also think that Southern organizations have capacity and capability to receive resources, including from global donors, such as Northern governments in terms of bilateral funding or foundations. They can receive those funds directly. They don't have to go through Northern organizations, so that Northern organization can pass on those resources to Southern partners. And oftentimes I feel like Northern organization, we are part of a problem where we always just find that maybe there is no capacity that is adequate enough by Southern organization, and therefore it is really critical for Northern organization to step in and do all the heavy lifting in terms of heavy reporting. But I think the question should be, why should there be those requirements in the first place? Is that where change will really come from? Can we challenge donors, one, to give money directly to Southern organizations, and two, to remove requirements that are really tedious, and they make us believe that Southern organizations lack capacity, but actually they don't lack capacity. They never lacked capacity in terms of bringing about change, in terms of advocacy, in terms of, doing work on ground. I think when they talk about capacity, they're talking about capacity to design log frames and design theory of change as they have been perceived by the Northern donors and Northern organizations. And as Northern organizations, I think we need to challenge that.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Dinah. There was a lot of nodding in the room, and I also saw Priyanthi nodding a lot. So thank you for sharing those reflections. And now I would like to pose the same question to you, Priyanthi. So do you think these two roles are useful? Do you see any other further roles that Northern organizations could play? And could you identify the strengths and the weaknesses from your point of view of these two roles?
Okay, thanks. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Dinah, for that. It made it easier for me to say what I have to say, because you've said a lot of what should be said. First, I think before I actually say anything, I just want to say that as one of the people who were interviewed by GADN and who was a peer-reviewed it, I just want to add that many of us don't completely endorse everything that's obviously in the draft and in the paper. And some of us were concerned when we saw the draft that what we really wanted to say wasn't captured enough. So I'm really happy that the final paper is much stronger and much more unequivocal in its positioning than the initial draft. Also want to add that I'm glad, listening a little bit to what went on before, that you see this conversation as an ongoing one, that because it's much too important to end with this paper and this meeting. We need to continue to be reflexive and create spaces for these difficult conversations. So many thanks to GADN team for creating one such space. But going to the two questions, I'd like to move a little bit back from the practicality of those two questions, because I think, as I think one of my quotes say in the paper, the Global North NGOs challenging Northern governments and corporations in redistributing the resources they get more back to the Global South. These two questions, the first one particularly, is something that all civil society organizations working on global justice must do. And while I agree that there is a need to correct the disparities in the funds or income coming from the coming to Global North and Global South NGOs, I think that in itself will not resolve the kind of redistribution of resources that we in the South are calling for. What we are calling for is reparations, or the demand to give indigenous lands back to First Nations people, or financing loss and damage, or dismantling tax havens, or as Dinah said, ensuring the equal distribution and sharing of vaccines. And that is not really dependent on the money coming through NGOs. It's dependent on a lot of other funding and power relations that happens outside the civil society sector. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to challenge, because we all know to challenge all of that and not just limit ourselves to those two roles. And for that, I think in your paper, you had a section on the concept of solidarity. And I think that is what you really need to center in what we need to center when we work together as Global North and Global South NGOs. Because as you rightly say in your paper, that concept of solidarity breaks away from the framings of charity and paternalism, and it also breaks away from the concept of atonement. Solidarity is based on shared vision and shared politics. I think Sanam Amin had a very beautiful quote in there which said, solidarity is the most unselfish form of love. You're standing up for people who cannot, for a cause that you might never see the realization of. And I think that is what is at the center of our fight for global justice. And in that fight, or in that fighting for that common cause, we already know who the perpetrators are. And working together, we should be able to identify what our collective actions need to be, and how, again, as you say in your paper, how we can each use the power we have. So if Global North NGOs have the power to mobilize funds and the power to access the decision makers in those very institutions that perpetrate and perpetuate global injustice, then they need to use that. But we also need to recognize that that is just one kind of power, a power that is no more superior to the power of lived experience or the power of local knowledge or the ability to mobilize communities, etc. And if we realize it like that, and we realize that there is an equality in the kind, or we assess the different powers we have in an equal way, then we can work together, create a common plan of action, and collectively agree as equals, using our different powers to engage in active solidarity, as someone said in the paper, or make change. And I think that means dismantling the perception or the inbuilt kind of self-consciousness of the power imbalance among ourselves. All the other issues being Southern-led, extractivism of local knowledge, inequality in NGO budgets, what are the appropriate ways to consult, etc., all operate within that neo-colonial framework of development aid. And that framework assumes the superiority of Northern organizations and Northern epistemologies. So it is that coloniality of power that we need to extricate ourselves from. And when I say we, I think obviously Global North organizations, but also all of us in the South. We just need to recognize that we all have different kinds of power, and that we can pool those different kinds of power to achieve the end we want.
Thank you so much, Priyanthi, for those really critical points and for continuing to challenge us. That's very much appreciated. And for the next, second and last question, just briefly, because then we'll move into a more open space and we want to have time for that as well. So both of you have interesting experiences in bridging the global North-South divide in different ways. So from your perspective, briefly, what would you say are some of the practical things to avoid and what could Northern organizations do better in working with Southern-based organizations? And for this one, I'd start with Priyanthi and then move to Dinah.
So I think, I mean, if we carry on from what I just said, right, I think then the idea is to listen, to not, to do all those things I said, like we need to be able to listen to each other. We need to respect each other's power as being different, but equally valuable. And then I think, we need to recognize that this is a collective or common cause. This global injustice is not just something that is a problem for people in the global south. It's also a problem for society, the whole world. And I think if we start looking at that differently and coming to the table as equals and not kind of privileging ourselves in any way, then I think that's how we should go.
Thank you so much. And over to Dinah with the same question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I definitely agree with everything Priyanthi has said. But for me, I think what I wanted to say to colleagues in the Northern organizations, if we don't hear anything from this talk, at least take one thing, and that is stop putting in your proposals and your publication that you're building capacities of Southern organizations. I cannot believe that up to this date, I still read proposals that say that we are going to build and mentor and coach Southern-based activists and organizations. I don't know what that really means and what you are building capacities about, which capacity you are building, because I do think that we all have capacities, maybe different capacities coming from different perspectives and different contexts, and that the space that we need is a space for cross-learning, for learning from each other, for building each other's capacity. And to be honest, if we are still writing proposals that talk about building capacities of Southern organization, then I think there's a big problem that you're not recognizing, what the issues are that we need to address and fight against. So that's one. The second one, I think, is around exploitation of labor. As Northern organizations, we know that we draw a lot of legitimacy from Southern organization, and I talk about that in the paper. Because of that, we are constantly sending surveys. We are constantly asking for consultation through Zoom calls. We are constantly, asking all these things, and oftentimes that labor is not recognized. It's not compensated for. And to be quite honest, for Southern-based organization, the organization are doing advocacy, but they are also doing projects on ground. Like the time is so limited to actually be able to answer all those requests, to respond to all those requests. So I think it is really important to avoid doing that and to be mindful of the organization's time in doing so. And if you need inputs from Southern partners, then compensate for their time. Compensation for their time is key. And I know those are simple things, but yet they still happen. So I think it is important to talk about them. But also avoiding treating Southern partners, organizations as extensions of Northern-based organization projects, whereby you sit in your organization in London, design your project, and then ask Southern partners to implement part of that. I think that's dangerous in terms of also wasting the potential and the time of Southern organizations in terms of what they could have been doing in terms of working on their mission and their objectives. And so it is really important that if we're working together, we are working in a way that is supporting that different vision that we have for our organizations and for our communities. But also, I think really moving away from the charity mentality is really important, and speaking more about social justice and the role that different actors are playing. I think Priyanthi has already talked about the fact that money is one resource, but there are also other resources that are extremely key. I don't think with only funding we could achieve gender like global social justice. but it is with funding as a resource, but also with knowledge, with context, with mobilization capabilities, and all those different resources that we are able to achieve a common good. And I think we need to acknowledge that, yeah, there's also power of all those resources, and therefore that we are not helping others, but we are all in the ecosystem of making change. And the final one is, I think, the poverty porn, the way we like to portray Southern women as victims, as powerless, as very poor, because that's the narrative that is selling to be able to get money. I think I talked about how Northern organizations, including my own organization, raise money through individual giving. But oftentimes that means that we are also portraying women in such narratives because that's what individuals that give us money want to hear. But are we going to challenge that? Are we going to actually start to change that narrative so that even individuals giving organization money understand that it's not about some ex-poor women victims somewhere, that there is work beyond that we are working on global inequalities, we are working on social justice, and that it's not about, yeah. Okay, I'll stop here.